Alright folks, today I'm going to present to you another case of environmental storytelling in the Walking Dead universe. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this series, but if not, environmental storytelling is a technique where a series of objects or bodies will be laid out in a way that conveys a story to the viewer without explicitly stating what that story is. In today's video, I'm going to be taking a closer look at how the West Georgia Correctional Facility fell. And I don't mean when the governor attacked it, but how it was overrun by the dead at the beginning of the outbreak. The prisoners tell us a decent amount on what happened here, but it's the smaller details left behind that will help us paint a clearer picture. I'm going to structure this video by taking you through the evidence as it was first presented to us before going back and attempting to piece together how everything went down the way it did. These videos aren't meant to convince you I'm right, just to start a conversation around an interesting small topic in this franchise. We'll probably never actually get answers to these questions anyway, so it's all just for fun in the end. If you have suggestions for future topics, let me know in the comments down below, and drop a sub to see more videos like this. After a long winter moving from place to place, our survivors were determined to find somewhere safe to call home before Lori's baby arrived. And luckily, during a hunt in the Season 3 premiere, Rick and Daryl would come across the overrun West Georgia Correctional Facility that looked to have fallen extremely early into the outbreak, meaning it was more than likely still fully stocked with supplies. It was perfect, and without any damage to the fences, our survivors would quickly clear the yard before nightfall and get the gates closed. However, the question of how exactly this place would have fallen still lingers, with the presence of a turned-over prison bus pressed up against the gate thickening the mystery. But the next morning, Rick and company pushed forward deeper into the trashed courtyard with hand-to-hand combat, encountering walkers that had been fully decked out in riot gear on top of those dressed in jumpsuits. Theoretically, these guards should have made it out. We even saw Glenn use riot gear in Season 4 to tank through a horde. We see blood and scuff marks on the armor, but it doesn't really look like any of these guards were fatally bit from what I can see. Instead, it looks to me like they may have been beaten down with weapons by the living. But after discovering how to take them out, our group would clear the courtyard before locking the inner gate that was leaking the walkers out from the tombs. Unfortunately, it would be discovered there were civilian walkers among the dead prisoners, meaning there was a breach to the outside somewhere within. Regardless, this place was way too good to pass up. So pushing inside the compound, our survivors would find the interior was even more trash than the outside. However, above the common area lies a guard's body that had been shot in the head by what I initially believed to be prisoners. But the leftover keys tell a bit of a different story, as it wouldn't exactly make sense for escapees to leave them behind. Either way, Rick and company now had access to the cell blocks, where they would discover a similar tornado-like scene. What's interesting, however, bodies of prisoners who appear to have been shot in the head still lie motionless in their open cells, while turned walkers on the second level reach for Rick and Daryl through locked bars. But after clearing them out, they now had a place to sleep. However, there was still a ton of prison left to secure. So armoring up with pieces of their newfound riot gear, Rick and company begin to push into the tombs, discovering more permanently dead corpses through each hall they pass through. Some of the bodies are surrounded by pools of blood, indicating they had been devoured by the dead, while others nearby appear to have been shot in the head, painting the scene of a guard discovering prisoners eating other prisoners before putting them all down. It's clear this place was an absolute madhouse during the fall, as on top of the copious amounts of bodies, our survivors would run into even more walkers that weren't as fortunate to be put down, causing a panic as our group is split up, leading to Herschel getting bit on the leg by a lurker that had gone dormant awaiting a meal to cross its path. Frantically, our survivors would make their way to the screams before rushing Herschel to the nearest safe area, which would take the form of a cafeteria that had been locked from the outside with handcuffs. And on the other side of that door lied 5 prisoners, alive and well, that had been locked in since the beginning, surviving off the cafeteria's food supplies. According to them, it all happened 10 months ago, as a riot unlike anything they've ever seen broke out. And during the chaos, a guard had looked out for them by sliding Tomas a gun while locking them in, but they would never return to free them. It's clear they had absolutely no clue what was happening, as they question why they don't just bring Herschel to a hospital while asking if they've ever heard of people coming back to life and eating others. Which tells me, if they barely knew about the walkers, this riot more than likely hadn't started out of fear for the Walking Dead. It was over something else. The inmates don't really tell us anything else in regards to how the prison fell for the rest of their story on the show, but their actions and words do show us there had been quite the divide amongst the population, as some were more vicious than others like Tomas. Regardless, over the next few episodes, our survivors would routinely attempt to clear the tombs, but the mystery of where the civilian walkers came from still remained. That is, until Season 3, Episode 8, during the introduction of Tyrese and Sasha, as they come across the prison from the opposite side, entering through the administrative building that clearly had seen some form of fire breakout as rubble had crashed down and busted open the brick wall. Obviously, the fire was caused by the riot, but between this and the turned over bus, it seems like there may have been various escape attempts while everything was going down. But like the rest of the prison, our survivors would eventually secure the breach before building this place into a real home. Now, it may not be a mystery that the fall of this prison was initiated by the riots, but there are still tons of details that help us paint a full picture as to how all these events went down and connected. I'm now going to attempt to piece all these details together to paint a clearer picture on this horrific story, but remember, I am just theorizing based on what I've noticed, so it's entirely possible I could misinterpret or miss some evidence altogether. But like always, this is where you guys come in. I'd love to hear what you believe happened here in the comments down below. Before the world fell, the West Georgia Correctional Facility was no stranger to violence, as it held hardened criminals such as Tomas and Andrew while facing issues with breakouts, forcing the state to put up signs warning those in the area of escaped inmates. But being cut off from the outside world, nobody on the inside would be aware of what was coming as the dead began to walk while they were none the wiser. However, that would all change when an inmate would be strangled to death by another in his cell due to a past conflict on the day of August 27th, 2010, aka Monument Day. Knowing the social divide among the prison, it would not be a surprise this happened, but it would be when the wounded man stood up as if unaffected from the pain. However, something wasn't right with him, as he would appear out of his mind and attack the guard while out of the other inmate's sight, forcing them to shoot the man the others believed to be hurt and in need of assistance. This would be the catalyst that would initially start the riot, as those who watched their friend die by the hands of a bad apple would become irate after seeing him take a bullet to the head for what they perceived to be no reason and begin trashing the cell blocks, with the noise of the chaos inspiring the rest of the inmates to rise up as well. But it wasn't for a united cause, as someone used the opportunity to get vengeance on the guards, and despite the riot gear, they would eventually be overpowered by the prisoners who would beat them to death in the chaos, using whatever they could as blunt objects before moving on to create more chaos. But while they were rioting on behalf of their fallen friend, other bad apples had different concerns, as they would use the opportunity to settle past discrepancies with more inmates, using the cover of the riot to shank them down before unknowingly adding more walkers to the chaos. The guards who found themselves unprepared, trapped, and alone within the prison walls would try to hold out as long as they could. But when the situation with the dead became clear, they would opt out with a bullet to the head when it appeared hope was lost, explaining why we see the guard's set of keys left behind. But others were only interested in one thing: escape, just as many of their peers had done before. During the riots, a group would attempt to break out by starting a fire in the administrative building using whatever they could find to build the flames, hoping they'd be able to burn a hole right through this death trap. But naturally, this would quickly spiral out of control, attracting freshly turned walkers from the outside that would block their smoky path further. Unfortunately, their way back through the tombs would now be facing a similar issue, with smoke spreading throughout the halls as the prisoner walkers emerged thanks to the deadly riot, leading to quite the massacre as they would tear into the still living inmates. But those who made it all the way through wouldn't be out of the woods yet, as they would find themselves trapped in the yard surrounded by the fences as their dead peers closed in. Whether or not a set of keys were grabbed on their way out, it wouldn't matter as they were quickly running out of time to find the right one for the lock. But some would have the idea to use their strength to push over the prison bus with their limited time, giving them something tall to climb on top of while they were surrounded by the dead. Now, there are a couple things that could have happened here. The first, a few prisoners actually managed to escape by using their boots to carefully climb over the fence, past the barbed wire, escaping into the wasteland to God knows where. Alternatively, while climbing, officers who were in the guard towers would shoot the prisoners down as they were just as unaware of the cannibalistic massacre happening inside, believing this escape to have simply been a result of the riot, with the fresh walkers on the outside appearing to still be alive from afar, before they themselves would eventually flee for their lives after realizing what was happening. Or hell, maybe the prisoners climbed inside the bus for safety and were knocked over by the dead. But it would have to be a pretty big horde to actually turn it over, so that's up in the air. It's kind of hard to place the bus's purpose, so let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. But despite the violent animosity on all sides, some remaining officers would become aware of the Walking Dead, and as the riot would devolve into a bloody massacre, they would be unable to leave the surviving prisoners behind out of moral obligation. So, out of great risk to their own safety, they would begin fighting back while searching for survivors throughout the corridors. Those they came across would be escorted to the cell blocks and locked into their cells for the time being, as it seemed like the safest option given the scenario. But as they got deeper, it would become increasingly difficult to reach the common areas, as no matter how many walkers feasting on their peers they took out, there would always be more around the corner, leaving the officers with no choice but to lead the 5 remaining survivors they found to the cafeteria before handing over a gun and locking them in for what would unknowingly be the next 10 months. What followed would be a violent death for all officers that stuck their necks out for those who hated them, as despite the gas masks used during the riots that would allow them to breathe in the smoke-filled tombs, it did not help with their visibility, as the dead would come for them before digging into the exposed areas of their skin. And by nightfall, the screaming would subside as every prisoner and guard inside the correctional facility would either be dead or turned. Well, not all. As we know, some had been escorted to safer areas by the brave guards before their fall, but unlike those in the cafeteria who had everything they'd need for long-term survival, the inmates who were locked in the cells for protection would be put through an entirely different type of hell, as the only source of water would be what remained in their disgusting toilets. But that was really the least of their worries, as no food was to be found in the cells, leading to a slow, agonizing death caused by starvation. That is, if they didn't already catch some sort of deadly illness from the toilet water. But with that, the West Georgia Correctional Facility would lie as the ultimate trial for a survivor over the next year. Even the large camp of Woodbury refused to take on the challenge despite the immense reward. However, for Rick Grimes and his band of survivors, it was nothing but a chore, as the horrors of that fateful day would eventually fade away to history. Now, is this interpretation perfect? No, probably not. But going through these little clues left behind is what constantly reinvigorates my love for this franchise. The bus was quite difficult to place, but I think the explanations I gave at least make sense. As for the administrative building, it's totally possible that could have just been a result of the riot and not an escape attempt. But with only one area set ablaze, it looked to have been targeted specifically, but it's hard to say. But whether or not you agree with my interpretation, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this scene in the comments down below. In the end, it doesn't really matter what happened here, but these kind of background stories are what make this world feel lived in. And most importantly, scary. But that's gonna do it for me today, folks. If you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button to see more. Thanks so much for watching.